You know that feeling when your mood just seems, well, off? Almost like there's some hidden dial controlling your
Yeah.
emotions.
Yeah, definitely.
We get so much advice about mental well-being,
Uh,
but today we're cutting through some of that noise.
right.
We're going straight to something pretty fundamental, a piece that, often gets missed. How your hormones directly, powerfully influence how you feel,
Yeah,
your mental state.
exactly. We've been looking at this really interesting document that just unpacks that link. It's kind of amazing when you think about it.
It is.
These tiny chemical messengers just floating around in your body, having such a huge impact on your brain.
Uh,
And the source material really emphasizes this. If your brain is just full of receptors, they're incredibly sensitive, even to like subtle hormonal shifts.
so, okay, our mission for
Yeah.
this deep dive is to pull out the really crucial stuff from this document.
Yep.
We're zeroing in on 3 key hormones, how they directly hit your mental health, hopefully giving everyone listening a clearer picture of what might be going on, under the surface.
Yeah.
Now, it's important to say the document is clear. Mental well-being isn't just hormones.
Oh, absolutely not.
It points to, big societal things,
Yeah.
rapid economic changes, job insecurity is a big one, some negative sides of tech, the fast pace of life, all contributing factors.
That's a really crucial point. Mental health is complex, multifaceted.
Yeah.
But the document also stresses, let's focus on what we can influence, right?
Right.
And our hormonal balance. That's potentially something we can impact. So yeah, let's dive into these key players.
Okay, let's do it. First up, TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, and the thyroid hormones themselves, T3 and T4.
Mm-hmm.
Now, simply put, these are the main regulators of your body's engine speed, your
Yeah.
metabolism.
Precisely. Yeah. T3 and T4, they're the ones actually doing the metabolic heavy lifting, produced by the thyroid gland down in your neck.
Okay.
But their production, that's controlled by TSH. And TSH comes from the pituitary gland.
Which is in the brain.
Right, a tiny little gland in your brain. So you've got this constant chatter, this back and forth between your brain and your thyroid.
But the TSH story gets even, more interesting when you look at its direct brain impact.
Uh-huh.
The document highlights this connection that I found surprising, actually. We think of TSH just as a thyroid marker, but it seems it's also a peptide with its own jobs in the central nervous system.
Yeah, it's like it has the side gig in the brain.
Exactly.
And here's where it gets really, really interesting for mental well-being.
Okay.
The source points to a link, higher TSH levels correlating with lower levels of something called BDNF.
Brain-derived neurotrophic factor.
Exactly, BDNF. In the brains of people dealing with depression. Now, BDNF, you can think of it like fertilizer for your brain cells.
Keeps things sharp.
Keeps things sharp, helps with cognitive function. And the document notes simple things like exercise can actually boost your BDNF. So the big takeaway here is that a thyroid that's even just a bit off, maybe not full-blown disease yet, could be impacting the very, building blocks of your brain's resilience.
Wow. Okay, so when would someone's TSH levels typically go up?
Generally, it's when the thyroid gland itself isn't making enough T3 and T4.
Right.
So that could be clear-cut hypothyroidism, the thyroid's really underactive, or even something called subclinical hypothyroidism.
Milder.
A milder form, yeah, where the TSH is elevated, but T3 and T4 might still be technically in the normal range, but maybe not optimal for that person.
And what does this source say about, what can be done if TSH is high?
Well, sometimes lifestyle changes can make a difference. Things like improving body composition, reducing excess body fat, that can sometimes help nudge TSH levels back down.
Okay.
But in other cases, medication is needed, usually thyroid hormone replacement, giving the body the T3 or T4 it's missing.
Makes sense. Yeah. Now let's connect it directly to how we feel. Mood.
Mm-hmm.
What happens when these thyroid hormones are out of whack?
Yeah, the document details this well. Both too much and too little can really throw your mood for a loop. With hyperthyroidism, that's excess thyroid hormone, people often feel really agitated, irritable, just generally in a bad mood, lots of anxiety.
Okay.
The good news there is anti-thyroid medication, stuff that calms the thyroid down, usually improves those symptoms quite a bit.
And the flip side, not enough hormone hypothyroidism.
Exactly. The symptoms tend to be almost the opposite. Apathy is a big one. A lack of motivation, like it's hard to get going, and just overwhelming fatigue. Yeah. And again, giving that missing thyroid hormone via medication often makes a really significant positive difference.
So for anyone listening, understanding this thyroid mood link could be really important if you've had these unexplained energy dips or, emotional shifts.
Definitely worth looking into.
All right, let's shift gears. Let's talk about cortisol. The source calls this one the hormone most strongly linked to mental health. We hear cortisol and stress together all the time.
We do, and for very good reason. The document really hammers home how vital cortisol is. It's not just stress.
Right.
It's involved in metabolism, your immune system, cardiovascular health, bone health, brain function. I mean, everything. The source literally says, without cortisol, you die.
Wow. Okay, that really puts it in perspective.
Yeah.
So cortisol itself isn't the enemy.
Not at all.
It's the fluctuations,
Yeah,
the pattern. That's the issue.
precisely. The document flags exacerbated fluctuations in cortisol secretion as a risk factor for psychiatric disorders.
Okay.
Think of cortisol like your body's alarm system. A brief alarm, helpful, gets you moving,
Yeah.
but an alarm that's just constantly blaring,
Yeah.
that wears everything down, including your mental state.
Right.
The source even suggests cortisol levels might potentially predict future mental health problems or how severe they might get.
That's a powerful thought. Now, the source links cortisol and stress through the HPA axis, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Sounds technical.
It does sound technical, but we can break it down.
Please do.
Think of the HPA axis as like your body's central stress response command center.
Okay, command center. I like that.
When you encounter stress, could be physical, could be mental, this axis fires up. And that leads to cortisol release from the adrenal glands, which sit on top of your kidneys.
Gotcha.
It's a totally normal, necessary response designed to help you deal with challenges. But when it's constantly overactive, chronic stress, that's when the problems start.
Like that vicious cycle the document mentions with cortisol and depression.
Exactly that cycle. So ongoing stress keeps the HPA axis in overdrive. That means consistently high cortisol, which in turn increases your risk of depression. But, and this is key, depression itself can also lead to higher cortisol production.
Oh, wow. So it feeds itself.
It becomes this self-perpetuating loop really hard to break out of sometimes.
Okay, so why? Why does cortisol hit our brain, our mental well-being, so hard?
Well, your brain is just packed with receptors for cortisol. They're called glucocorticoid receptors.
Oh.
And there's a really high concentration in two key brain areas. The hippocampus. Memory central, yeah. And the prefrontal cortex.
Decision-making, planning.
Conscious decision-making, higher-level thinking, executive function. Exactly.
So what happens when those areas are just constantly flooded with too much cortisol?
Well, the document explains that excessive cortisol can actually impair both memory and that executive function we just mentioned.
Right.
Your ability to plan, focus, make deliberate choices.
Yeah.
And that can easily contribute to a downward spiral, right?
Yeah, I could see that.
Poorer sleep, more fatigue, that constant feeling of being on edge, hyper alert, that whole state we associate with chronic stress. It's all deeply connected.
It really drives home that stress isn't just, a feeling in your head. It's got real biological consequences in the brain.
Absolutely.
Sounds like the specific ways cortisol messes with the brain can be a whole deep dive on its own sometime.
It really could. Now, let's move to our third key hormone, prolactin.
Prolactin. Okay, most people probably think lactation, breastfeeding.
Right, that's its main well-known job, facilitating milk production triggered by a baby suckling. That's primary. But it actually does more than that. The source highlights its role in modulating or sort of adjusting stress responses.
Interesting.
And not just during pregnancy and lactation, but throughout life. And for both women and men, it's not just a female hormone.
That's a really important point. Okay, now the document brings up something quite interesting about prolactin, its ability to kind of inhibit sexual function.
Yes. When prolactin levels get high, hypoprolactinemia, it can suppress that communication pathway between your brain and your reproductive system.
The hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. Another axis.
Another axis, yes.
Yeah.
And suppressing that can lead to hypogonadism, basically, reduced sexual function or interest in both men and women.
Yeah.
If you think about it biologically, especially during pregnancy, it makes a certain kind of sense, right?
Yeah. How so?
Well, the body's priority shifts. It's all about nurturing the developing baby, ensuring offspring survival. So temporarily putting reproduction on hold. That has an evolutionary advantage.
Okay, yeah. That makes a lot of biological sense when you put it like that.
Yeah.
So what about mental health implications when prolactin is higher than maybe it should be
Right.
outside of pregnancy?
Right. Well, first, there's the potential impact of, reduced sexual responsiveness itself on overall well-being that can affect mood and quality of life.
Sure.
But the document points out another intriguing effect. High prolactin can lead to a reduced reactivity of the HPA axis.
Wait, the stress axis we just talked about.
Yeah.
Reduced reactivity. So
Yeah.
less stress response. That sounds good. Maybe.
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But it's not necessarily beneficial in every situation. And here's a crucial point the source makes. Prolactin acts in opposition to dopamine.
Ah, dopamine. Motivation, pleasure, reward.
Exactly. A super important neurotransmitter. In fact, the treatment for high prolactin often involves dopamine agonists, drugs that basically mimic dopamine's effects.
Okay, so if prolactin goes up, dopamine's influence potentially goes down. Or they're working against each other.
They seem to have this opposing relationship in many brain circuits, yes.
So what does that mean for things like, our drive, our get up and go?
Well, think about that kind of relaxed, maybe less driven feeling after a significant dopamine surge and subsequent prolactin release.
Uh-huh.
The document actually uses the analogy of the post-orgasm feeling. That prolactin surge contributes to relaxation, a temporary dip in drive.
Right?
Chronically elevated prolactin might create a similar but ongoing dampening effect on everyday motivation. Less spark.
And how does this connect to bigger mental health issues?
The source points to a pretty significant connection with neuropsychiatric disorders and just generally poor mental health.
For example?
For example, studies show women with untreated depression often have higher prolactin levels than healthy controls. And there's a well-known link between high prolactin and postpartum depression, which, as the source notes, affects a significant number of women, up to 10%.
Wow. So it's not just like an indirect thing. Prolactin itself might be directly influencing mental state.
That seems to be the understanding, yes. The document suggests prolactin can have direct effects on the brain. It might make individuals more vulnerable to negative emotional states, things like depression, anxiety, hostility, even somatization.
Somatization. Like physical symptoms from psychological distress.
Exactly. And maybe even, in some cases, psychotic symptoms, especially if other risk factors are already present.
It's just incredible how these different chemicals, these hormones with their own primary jobs, weave together and impact our minds so profoundly.
It really is.
And the source even briefly mentions other factors bumping a prolactin besides sex, and other hormones too, like insulin, testosterone.
Yeah.
When they're out of balance, they also impact mental well-being.
Yeah.
Feels like we've only just scratched the surface here.
Yeah. We really have. But hopefully we've given everyone listening a solid overview of these three key hormonal players: TSH thyroid, cortisol, prolactin, and just how significantly they can influence your mental well-being based on this source material.
Absolutely. So just a quick recap.
Yeah.
We looked at TSH and thyroid hormones affecting energy and mood. Cortisol, central to stress, being both a cause and effect in mental health challenges.
Right.
And prolactin, going beyond lactation to impact motivation, sexual function, and maybe even susceptibility to negative emotions.
Yeah.
It's also interconnected.
And the key thing for you listening is just recognizing that these hormonal influences are, a real tangible part of your mental and emotional landscape.
Yeah.
Mental health is definitely complex. It's multifaceted. We said that. But understanding and maybe even optimizing these biological factors, that could be a really important piece of the puzzle for your well-being.
Yeah. Now, the source itself, it's honest about this pinning down direct cause and effect in research here. It's tricky.
Very challenging. Correlation doesn't equal causation, as they say.
Exactly. So it's crucial to remember these hormonal factors are likely one piece of that bigger mental health picture, not the whole story.
Absolutely.
So if anything we've talked about today resonates, if it sounds familiar based on your own experiences, it might be a really good idea to, chat with a healthcare professional, someone who can offer personalized advice.
Definitely recommended. And, thinking about all this interconnectedness raises a really interesting question to mull over.
Oh.
Yeah, just something to think about as you go about your day. Given how deeply linked these hormonal systems are, what other, maybe more subtle biological factors might be playing a bigger role in our daily moods or mental states than we currently fully grasp?
That's a good one.
It's such a fascinating area, right? So much more to explore.
Definitely gives you something to think about. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today.